I'd like to welcome you to tonight's opening class. We're going to go over the Evans Gambit. It's a double king pawn opening. It's one of the basic gambits. It used to be very popular in the early part of the 20th century and the 18th century, but it's not so popular anymore. But you need to know how to diffuse it to play against it, because if you play on the internet and someone plays it against you, if you don't have any idea what to do, you'll probably lose very quickly. A lot of the gambits that white can play are tricky, and if you don't have any idea what to do, you often lose quickly. But the way to diffuse them isn't that hard to learn. It's pretty much seen some grandmasters how they handle it for black. You can always get an even game. So sometimes when white gives up a pawn, you can actually get an ending advantage as black with some chances to win. But some of the gambits are what they call sound. That just means that for the pawn, white gets enough moves, gets enough pieces and pawns out ahead of black that he can get a strong enough attack to win his pawn back. That's called compensation. So white often gets adequate compensation for the pawn sacrifices. Most grandmasters today they only play a few gambits because chess opening theory has developed. They have it published in books and online how you should play against it. And if you know how to play against it, it's actually easier to get an even game against a gambit than if white doesn't sacrifice a pawn. So the really good players usually don't sacrifice a pawn like they used to 100 years ago. But it's part of the learning curve. And it's important for young and new players to see these gambits and learn the main idea, how to diffuse it. The Evans Gambit is named after an English sea captain who invented it sometime around 1850. I'm not sure when, but it was played a long time ago. And it starts out like, we're going to go through a game by former world champion Tigran Petrosian, and he's playing another grandmaster, Viorel Iordachescu. They're playing in some little town called Evgeny. I don't know where that is. European Championship 2013. That must be a different Petrosian than the world champion, because I thought the world champion had died, but maybe he was still alive then. I'm not sure. Anyway, we'll jump into it. So this is the standard way to start king pawn openings. And when black blocks your king pawn, it's called double king pawn. And the white knight comes out, that's the preferred move, because you develop a piece, a knight, and you make a threat against an undefended pawn, and you generally force black to defend the pawn. So white has the first move advantage, and he can keep that advantage 15 to 25 moves, provided he makes aggressive moves and forces black to defend. If white plays inconsequential moves and some pawn moves that aren't to the point, he lets black take over as if black had the first move. Then black starts making the threats and white has to defend. So the first move advantage and the ability to attack your opponent is called the initiative. And that's a big advantage. That's the only advantage white has at the start of the game. You need to maintain that as long as possible. So black does the standard defense. And now white's going to develop another piece, his king bishop. He puts it on c4. See how white's pieces and pawns are all in the 4 central squares and the square around the 4 center squares. The 4 center squares are, that's the center squares, the most important squares on the chessboard. The square around the center squares are called the near center squares. They're the next most important. Both sides try to control the center squares better than their opponent. Typically, neither side gets total control. Now we've only gone, let me make black's next move. So he brings out his bishop. We've made 3 moves. And you can see that white's bishop and pawn control this square. They can both move here. Black can't move the pawn up, he would just lose it. Black, knight, bishop, and pawn control this square. They prevent this move by white. Black's still in the defensive. White is attacking, black is defending. These bishops are equivalent and offset each other. White still has the move advantage. He can castle 1, and black can't castle yet. Castling is a good move. Another typical move, the bishop comes out, and then the pawn comes up, forming a pawn chain. You have to get your bishop outside your pawns. If you left the bishop here and put the pawn here, you would block the bishop and it wouldn't have any good squares. That would be passive. Now you could still get a draw, but you would have given black the initiative, and the advantage of having the move would move to black. That's a self-imposed bad opening idea. It's totally unnecessary, but lots of players do it. Another good move for white is bringing the knight here. Then the knight, bishop, and pawn control this square. Castles is good. That's about it. You wouldn't want to move this pawn. It does nothing. And there's no reason to move the rook pawn on the other side. The bishop can't even get out yet because it's blocked by the pawn. So moving a pawn on the side of the board is a waste of time. Time in chess, there are 3 elements in chess. Forces, that's your pawns and pieces. Time is you get more moves, you get your pieces out faster than your opponent. That's called a time advantage. And then there's a space advantage. That's who controls the most squares. Now, when white starts out, he has a time advantage due to the first move. There's not much space advantage. But you can convert the time advantage into a space advantage if you can move this pawn up here to the 5th row, driving the knight away. And then with the pawn here, you've opened up all these squares behind your 2 pawns. That gives white a space advantage. He can move his pieces back and forth and make threats on both sides of the board easier than black. Now, the idea is that you accumulate a time and space advantage, and you attack your opponent and you win a pawn or a piece. That's a material advantage. You need a material advantage of a pawn. You and I might need more than a pawn, but a grandmaster needs a pawn, and he can usually win the game. And the computers evaluate that as 1.00. A pawn is equivalent to 1. And that's how they set the other pieces, based off the pawn being set at 1. So they figure the knight and bishop are worth 3 pawns. The rook 5, queen 9. They don't value the king because you have to keep the king. If you lose the king, it's over. But it's interesting to note that the king hides in the early part of the game, typically behind these 3 pawns, because the other guy has his queen, rooks, knight. They're trying to checkmate him. But in the ending, after you trade off all your queens and rooks are gone, and some of the knights and bishops, the king gets bold and moves up and helps try to win pawns and advance any passed pawns you have to the queening square. In the ending, the king, according to Teresh, the guy I told you about, is worth more than a bishop or a knight. Because the king can go to any color square and 1 square in any direction. Now, a bishop has to stay on 1 color, black or white. The knight can cover both squares, but they're always alternating, white, black, so the king actually can push knights and bishops around unless they're protected by pawns or the king. So now we're at the point, this is called the Italian game. A branch of the Italian game is the Evans Gambit, which we're going to jump into right now. And white gives up a pawn, and you take with the bishop. You can decline. You don't have to take the pawn. You can move the bishop back here, and black can get an even game. But aggressive players want to force white to prove that he gets enough for the pawn, so the preference is to take the pawn. Now here's where white gets some time. White wants to move this pawn here, but he can't do that right now because pawn takes. He wants to have this pawn here and this pawn here, and if pawn takes, he has 2 center pawns, and he can shove them at the knight and force the knight away. This is the tempo, the time he gets for the pawn. He moves this pawn here, attacking the bishop with a gain of a move. So the bishop's moved twice, now it moves 3 times. The best move is to retreat here. We know he's going to move here. If you put your bishop here, you're giving him another attack on the bishop with the pawn move. If you go here, it's protected by the knight. And when this pawn comes here, this pawn, the bishop pins this pawn to the king. So bishop here is the only good move. In this game, white plays pawn to queen 4 right away. Sometimes they castle first and they'll play that the next move. They often transpose together later. Now what I'm going to show you is, at this point, there's several variations for black. I'm going to show you the soundest move for black. It's named after world champion Emanuel Lasker. It's Lasker's defense to the Evans Gambit. His idea was he'll give the pawn back that white sacrificed, but it will lead to a simplified ending where black has a small advantage. Not enough to win, but white will then shift to the defense. So what he does, he just protects his pawn, his center pawn. Now in this game, there are different ways to play this now from white's point of view. We got 2 games. This game, white accepts getting the pawn back, leads to a trade of queens, but he wins his pawn back. He could play more complicated, and that's our second game. This is the traditional Lasker defense idea, and the other is a more modern treatment which keeps it more complicated. Both games ended in a draw though. Okay, so white takes. Now you can't, it's a mistake to do knight takes. There's a check here on the bishop. So you do pawn takes. Now the queens are opposing each other. The knight protects the pawn and the knight protects the bishop. Here's how white gets his pawn back. He trades queens. Now black could take with the king, but then his king's stuck in the middle of the board and he's not safe. And after the knight and bishop or castles, a rook can come here and check the king. So black says, I'm not going to take with the king. I'm going to give this pawn back. I'm going to take with the knight. So white gets his pawn back. Now it's black's turn. The knight and bishop are attacking this square, but the knight and king adequately defend it. But black has a good developing move. He's going to attack this bishop and stop any threats by this bishop and knight forever by bringing out his bishop. And his bishop is defended by the knight. So if the bishop takes, the knight takes, it's a completely equal game. In fact, black has better pawn structure. See, these are three connected pawns on the queen side, and white only has two. White has a king side pawn majority with these four pawns versus three. Now typically the king will castle, or it'll move here and here. It'll be on the king side. Because of that and the pieces, it's harder for white to get a passed pawn. He has to move all four pawns up and to trade off three, and then he's left with a pawn that would be a passed pawn. Black has an easier job. There's only two pawns. He only has three to bring up. He'll get his passed pawn before white does. That will give black a slight ending advantage. Not enough to win the game. But anyway, white no longer has any winning attempts unless black makes a blunder. Well, white doesn't want to trade the bishops, so he chooses to go here, check. Not a problem. We just advance our pawn and drive the bishop back. So he goes here. Now, he wouldn't come here because he's attacking a pawn defended by a pawn. He would have to move back here or here to do anything. So he's going to retreat this way. Now he was here. He's not going to go here. And he wouldn't go here because this file's open. He wants to put a rook on the open file, and the bishop would block the rook. And he wouldn't go here. That's undeveloping. This is the only move. Well, black's going to bring out his knight and castle. So he brings out the knight. Now he's attacking this pawn that's undefended. You see, the initiative has passed to black. He's making the threat. But white has a perfectly good way to defend it with moving that pawn up. And black castles. White comes back here with the knight to drive the bishop back. He can't move this knight out till the bishop's off the pawn, so he needs to drive the bishop back. In this case, black chooses to take the bishop because he didn't want to retreat his. And then he brings up his knight from the back. And white still can't develop the knight because this pawn would be left. So what he's going to do is, he moved his king here. He's not going to castle. He's going to move it here. Let the king protect the pawn. Then he can move the knight here or here as he desires. And he can move the bishop out first. So black starts advancing his 3 queenside pawns by attacking the bishop. White doesn't want to retreat the bishop. He takes the knight, and the pawn takes. You can see it's becoming a simple game. White has a bishop and knight. Black has a bishop and knight. 2 rooks and a king. White does have a good center pawn protected by this pawn chain, but it has no attacking value. It's defensive. It'll stay this way. The king comes here. Black's pieces are better. His bishop's out. His knight's out. White has to move the king, and then he can move the knight and bishop out. So white's behind, but because the queens and other pieces are gone, white's in no danger. So he protects the pawn with the king. Black moves his rook to this open file. The knight comes out. The bishop drops back. The knight might have come here attacking the bishop. He'd have to move it back. And now the bishop can go on this diagonal, but the bishop here blocked the pawn. Remember, he wants to move the pawns up. So now he's ready to move the pawn up. Well, white knows these pawns are coming. He plays this pawn here to block the black pawns. Now, if black plays pawn here, white will not do pawn takes. He'll leave this pawn here blocking this pawn. And if pawn takes, he'll take with the rook, and the rook will block the pawn. That's a good defensive setup. Anyway, black is going to move his knight to a better square, because the knight here, it can't go here, here, or here. And he doesn't want to go to the side, so he's going to come here. Then he can come here or here, depending on circumstances. White comes here. If the black knight goes here, he can trade knights and get that much closer to a draw, because now it's just bishop versus bishop. And that's what black does, and that's what white does. So we're very close to a draw now. And he's ready to develop this bishop. So he attacks the rook. Rook moves up a square. Now he takes here, and this rook, which is not doing anything, comes over here and attacks this undefended pawn. You can't play pawn here, because this pawn, that rook's unprotected. Rook takes pawn, pawn takes rook, rook takes rook check. We would win a pawn and probably win the game. However, he moves the rook over. That's an adequate defense. The computer says completely even. So we're getting even closer to a draw. There's 5 pawns each, a bishop each, 2 rooks and a king. That's a good move. It blocks the pawn from going here. That's the one danger white has if these pawns create a passed pawn. He brings his king up, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes all the way back. He didn't want to trade bishops. He can drive this bishop back with pawn up and bring that other pawn here. And then he could move his bishop to g7 and attack this way. He just retreats the bishop. Now black gets his queenside pawns moving. But white can now trade the bishop. Okay, now rook and pawn endings are notorious for being drawn when pawns are even. And this is the case here. So black does pawn up. White was threatening to win this pawn. Takes, takes. Rook comes back, threatening to win the pawn. The pawn can't advance because rook takes pawn. He could do check here, but rook up here. Rook takes, king takes. Then the king can go here and he would lose this pawn. So he can't afford to trade rooks. He just moves the rook up here. White moves his rook here, so there's no check here. Black brings his king up, so it's close to the action, and it defends this pawn, and there's no check here if the rook goes off the second row. King comes up, attacking the rook. The rook moves up, protected by the pawn, driving the king back. Now the two rooks threaten the pawn again. So black has to go back, and they both, this repetition forces, and neither side has a better option, so they agree to a draw. 3 repetitions is a draw. And you can see there was no way either side could break through. Let's run through the first few moves of the opening. So this is the Italian game. Now the Italian game, they don't sack a pawn. The main line is here. They used to follow up with pawn here, but now they move here. When they moved the pawn here, it led to trading pawns and pieces, and it became a quick draw. So now they move the pawn here. There are no pawn trades. It's a maneuvering game. The game lasts 10, 20 moves longer. Both sides, it's more complicated. Both sides have chances to win or lose. If both sides play correctly, it's still even. Modern grandmasters prefer it, though, because the old move with this pawn here, after many games, they knew it was a draw. And they don't want to play draws, so there's no point to it. Okay, so the Gambit move is this move, sacrificing the pawn. The bishop takes. The knight can't take. It would leave this pawn undefended. Pawn up, bishop back, pawn up, takes, 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 takes. Got the pawn back. Bishop comes up. We're already at a drawn position. Black is a little better. His pawns are better on the queen side. White only has 2 pawns, and they're not connected. They're split. So you saw how he has to bring the king here to defend the pawn before he can move the knight out. That's adequate, but he has no winning chances. Now, we're going to go to a more modern game, but this was a quick draw too. This was played in 2012. A guy named, last name Najer, very strong. Both of these guys are very strong grandmasters. And a guy named Hrant. I don't know what country Hrant's from. Najer sounds like a German, but I'm not sure. They're playing in Germany. Maybe they're both Germans. Bundesliga, Germany. In Berlin, someplace in Berlin, 2012. Okay, so again, we get to the key part where this is where the Italian games go, but the gambit is here. Bishop takes, bishop takes, pawn up, pawn up. Now remember, pawn takes, queen takes is the Lasker method for black to get a draw. It diffuses white's initiative. White has a more complicated way to play. He brings his queen over here. The queen attacks this pawn, and the threat is bishop takes pawn check. It forces black to make what looks like an unusual move unless you've seen it before. He brings his queen up. Now the queen defends the pawn, and it also defends this diagonal because white could move the pawn here. Say the queen had gone here. The pawn would come here, the knight would go here, and check here would win the bishop. With the queen here, pawn up, the knight goes back here. There's no queen check. There's no losing the bishop. And after the pawn comes here, the bishop can retreat and have a nice diagonal. And the bishop would be protected by these pawns. And the knight here will swing over here and come up this way. That would be good for black. Well, it can go to b5, pinning the queen, but pawn up will drive the bishop away. This pawn is protected by a pawn and the knight and queen, so pawn takes, the bishop has to retreat. That's good for black. It would be a wasted move by white. In fact, pawn up is not a good move for white. White does a better move. Remember, white wants to attack. This pawn up locks the pawn chains. They block each other. The white pawns block white's bishop and queen. He wants to attack. He's a pawn down. He wants to open up lines, bring a rook to attack the queen, leave this diagonal open, and bring these knights and bishops out. So that's why he does pawn takes pawn. Now if pawn takes pawn, see how this diagonal would be open? The bishop would move here and black couldn't castle. Now he couldn't bring the knight here to block the bishop because the knight would block the queen and allow bishop takes pawn check. So the right move for black is not to take the pawn, but to retreat the bishop. And now black has a threat of knight here, attacking queen and bishop, taking the bishop, and then white's attack is gone. And if white does pawn takes pawn, he wouldn't take with the pawn, he would bring his knight out. And if pawn takes pawn, he would castle, and he might do queen takes, and he's ready to start a counterattack with the knight and the rook, and white's king's in the middle of the board. So white does not do pawn takes pawn. He hurries up and develops his knight. Now black takes the pawn, And white moves the bishop here, like I told you, so black can't castle. But since this bishop moved here, it freed this square for the knight, and we get the knight fork. Now he put his queen here. We can't take the bishop because he's threatening checkmate. Well, we have to block that diagonal, so we move our pawn up. The queen retreats. Now we can take the white squared bishop. And black has a choice here. He makes a move. Look at the scoreboard over there, the little black square. See the question mark, exclamation mark? Do you know what that means?
Is it good?
It's dubious.
Dubious, okay.
A good move is an exclamation mark. A bad move is a question mark. A dubious move is a move that doesn't really help black, and black had a better move. But it's not a bad move. He doesn't lose the game or lose a pawn. Black had the chance to have a slight advantage, and he throws it away with this move. It's just even. See the little equal sign after the move? That's what the computer says. This chess-based software, you right-click it, and you can put the little symbol that the computer tells you it's equal. That's how you put these signs out. You right-click it, and you put the dubious exclam and then the equal sign. All right. Now, you'll soon see that this is even. Here, let's see what black should have done. The computer says he should. This pawn was attacked by two knights. He could have defended it with that pawn. Notice that this pawn move weakens these white squares, but remember, our knight took the white squared bishop. So the only piece white has that can attack white squares are the queen. The queen's on a black square. Also, white's queen can move over here and guard the white squares, and the bishop can come up. So there's no danger to weakening the white squares, and it's important for black to defend the center pawn with a pawn. That's the better way to play. Now, white would get a temple attacking the queen. The queen moves up here. Then he gets a check. But the king can't castle, he just moves up. White castles. Now the knight comes out. And white's knight either is going to, that rook is going to come here and drive the knight back. The bishop guards this square, as does the knight, so there's no check here. He decides to take the bishop out. This is the computer telling us what to do. Now the rook that's behind the pawn comes out and defends the queen. And see how the two rooks defend the back row. They defend each other. Then white moves up to the white squares. His queen here was blocked by the pawn. So this is a better square. He just drops his knight back to a defensive posture. Rook comes up. That's a good square. See, there are no pawns here. So the rook can go here protected by the pawn and the queen. That's a strong square. That's called a hole in black's position. But black, that's the only hole black has, and he can defend it. So he brings the rook over. He's just going to trade some rooks. Knight comes back here. He wants to go here and block this pawn and attack this bishop. the king retreats. Remember, he couldn't castle. He moved here. The rook, it's almost like he castled. That's called manually castling. The king moves to a safe area behind the knight and the pawns after he got the rook out. The other white rook comes over. It is blocked by the knight. He takes with the rook. Pawn takes, driving the queen back. Now white has a passed pawn, which is an advantage. In this case, that pawn can't go anywhere. The queen and the knight guard this square, and the rook can come here. That pawn is not going anywhere. So it's even. Bishop comes up. And the bishop comes here. See, the bishop, queen, and knight all guard this square. That pawn's not going anywhere. In fact, the bishop's going to come here and block the pawn forever. Then the knight can go to a more active post. He doesn't need knight and queen defending it. Or it would free up the queen. Now the bishop blocked the queen from defending the pawn, but white can't take it. His bishop's unprotected. Rook here would attack the queen and win the bishop. And then the rook will move here, or the pawn can move here. And according to the computer, see the equals over plus in the black box? The top symbol is white, equal. The bottom symbol is black, plus. It's a small advantage for black. If it was a small advantage for white, you'd have the plus sign on top and the equal sign. Now a big advantage would be for black would be just not an equal sign, a minus over a plus.
A big advantage
for black. Minus over plus. Equal plus, small advantage, about a third of a pawn, 0.33. A big advantage is about a half to 2/3 of a pawn, from 0.5 up to 0.66. You need a pawn up to win. So a big advantage is not winning advantage, but it's getting close. Now a winning advantage, it's not one over the other. If it's white, it's plus and then a minus sign. So black is on the right. If black wins, it's a minus followed by a plus sign. That's a winning advantage, and it's more than 1 point, like 1.2 or something. Anyway, we'll stop here. So white played knight takes, and he should have brought the pawn up, and he would have kept a slight advantage. He played here, and it's completely even. It gives up a pawn. So the knight takes the pawn. The other knight comes out and attacks the pawn that's undefended. Queen comes up, check. Now black has a choice. He can play the bishop and block the check, or the knight. He chooses to block with the knight. Rook comes over. But now the pawn move drives the queen. The queen's pinning the knight. The pawn move will drive the queen back. And the queen protects the bishop, as does the knight. Now if the queen went here, keeping the pin, the queen's here, so the queen and knight, this pawn would fork the queen and knight. So this would be a dangerous place to put the queen. the bishop could retreat, threatening to win this knight. Bishop takes knight, knight takes, queen takes, and there would be the threat of pawn here attacking queen and knight. So queen here would be a blunder. He just retreats one square. Now there's no fork. Black retreats, threatening to win the knight. This knight comes down, check. Bishop takes. Now he can't do rook takes, so he has to trade queens. The black queen was protecting the bishop. To get his bishop back, he had to trade queens. He took the knight, and black retreated here. And black's threat is bishop takes knight.
Let's go back one minute. Why is the knight? Why does the bishop take the knight? Or the
Rook takes this bishop.
Or why does king takes the knight?
But then pawn here, the bishop's pinned to the king. So he's going to get the piece back. He chose to retreat the bishop. Now, it looks like he gives up this pawn. So knight takes pawn. They agreed to a draw. He doesn't threaten anything because knight takes pawn. The bishop protects the pawn. Yeah, the two bishops give black equality. The pawns are even. No, white's a pawn up. Two. But the two bishops give black equality because they're stronger than the knight and bishop. And he can drive the knight back with this move. So the knight would have to go here, here, here. Let's say he goes here. Now this bishop can come up here and attack this pawn, and he gets strong threats, I guess. Or he might just come over this way and then bring the rook over. But like you said, the two bishops give him equality, so both players agreed to a draw. So let's run through that one more time. Just the opening. Here's the gambit. Pawn up, bishop back, pawn up, pawn up. Now, the easiest draw is the pawn takes trading queens. That goes into an even ending. But black, you have to remember the queen has to go in front of the bishop because there's a threat of pawn here and queen here check, picking up the undefended bishop. So the queen has to stay on that diagonal. You got to remember that. Pawn takes, bishop back. That's a good move. It frees this square up. The knight here attacks queen and bishop. Once you get rid of that bishop, white's attack is gone. Knight out, pawn takes, bishop here, but now we get the knight fork, queen up threatening checkmate, so you got to block it, queen back, now you got the bishop, and it's an even game right here. And black had two ways. He chose here. According to the computer, he'd have a slight advantage as he chose this move. Rook here, 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 knight here, knight takes. So according to the computer, that's even.